Alrighty. Okay, folks, I'm going to switch over to share screen, and I'm going to share the Kaplan translation of the Sefer Yetzirah. I'm assuming everybody can see that now. And we will, okay, so I'm going to read it as I usually do, first in Hebrew, and then read his translation. I don't think his translation of this particular Mishnah, this particular teaching, actually covers it properly, covers it sufficiently. I'm not arguing with his translation, it's correct, but I don't think it goes far enough, and I will explain why shortly. All right, so he starts off with Elo es Sefiros bli ma. These are the Sephirot without substance. Achat ruach Elokim Chaim, the one living. He explains it as the breath of the living God. I call it I'd rather say the spirit of the living God, and you'll see why soon enough. Ruach bi ruach, he says breath from breath. I say spirit from spirit. Mayim mi ruach, water from spirit. Eish mi mayim, fire from water. Roim v'tachas, the highest and the lowest. Mizrach u'marav, the east, the west. Tzafon v'darom, north and south. Up, down, east, west, north, south, as he says. Okay, I'm now going to explain it. And first of all, I'd like to give you a little bit of background to this is the last Mishnah, the last teaching in this chapter, in the first chapter of Sefer Yetzirah. And the first chapter of Sefer Yetzirah takes us through basically the setup of the Sephirot, the setup of the divine emanations that are called the Sephirot. Now, there are several approaches to understanding the Sephirot. The approach that the Sefer Yetzirah takes at this particular juncture is actually the way the Sephirot are in their original source, the way they are in Keter. Let me just bring up an image of the Sephirot here. I hope we can all see this. It should be, let me just see here, 1 second. Let me just get the comments to see if you can see. Could someone just comment if you could see it? Where are the comments now? They disappeared. Chat, here we go. Okay. Can everyone see the image of the Sephirot? Yes, okay, good. All right, perfect. So we'll leave it at that. The Sefer Yetzirah is looking at the Sephirot as they are in the highest level, in other words, within Keter. If we talk about it in a more general sense, we're not talking about the Sephirot in general, we're talking about the Sephirot in the Or Ein Sof, in the infinite light, and the infinite light that comes after the Tzimtzum. There are some that explain it as the infinite light before the Tzimtzum. And what's the Tzimtzum? The Tzimtzum is the radical constriction that happened for the Or in the Or Ein Sof in order to make it appear to us, in order to make it valid and relevant to a finite creation and to finite creatures that we are. Now, the Sefer Yetzirah was explaining that these are called the Sephirot bli ma. Bli ma means without a particular characterization, because they are on such a high spiritual level that it's very hard to characterize them with limited terminology. The limited terminology, even the terminology of Kabbalah is ultimately limited, and therefore, what we want you to know is that the main thing about these Sephirot is that they are unlimited Sephirot. Sephirot bli ma are Sephirot that are unlimited. We can characterize them to a certain extent, but we can only characterize them through what we understand of the lower level of the Sephirot. What's in the highest level of the Sephirot HaGnuzot, as they call it, the hidden Sephirot, the Sephirot hidden in Keter, or if you want to say it in the Or Ein Sof, after the Tzimtzum, or even in the Or Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, before this constriction, very, very high level. It is mirrored all the way through. In other words, the same structure, the same paradigm appears all the way through the Sephirot from all of the worlds, from the world of Alam Kadmon, which is the highest of the worlds, through the world of Atzilut, the world of Bria, the world of Yetzirah, the world of Asiya, the lowest world. All the entire paradigm is repeated in each of these worlds. Let me just make this a little bit smaller so that you could probably see it a bit better. Let's see here. Yeah, that would include almost all the Sephirot. Let me just make it 100%, and that will be easier to see for everybody. Okay, there we go. You see, that's the entire paradigm, the Sephirot. This is repeated in all of the worlds, even in the world of Adam Kadmon. In the world of Adam Kadmon is where you get the Esses Sephirot, and even in the Or Ein Sof before Adam Kadmon, in the Kav, and in even in the Or Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, according to some explanations. In any event, there's something in the chat here. Okay. Private conversations going on. Okay, never mind. Okay, so those are the Sephirot. The interesting thing is that these Sephirot are also paralleled in the human soul. Now, I have another chart over here that makes the parallel between the Sephirot and the human soul. I'm going to again reduce it to 100%, and maybe you'll be able, it's still too big to be able to see properly the whole thing. In any event, as you can see, Keter corresponds to faith, delight, will, and the question that's always asked about Keter, what is the purpose, right? Chokhmah, wisdom, intelligence, and the inner dimension of Chokhmah is called Bittul, self-nullification. The question about Chokhmah, what is Chokhmah, is what inspires me. Bina is understanding and joy. Bittul is the incorrect thing here. It's understanding and joy. Why do I do what I do? This is incorrect. I have to actually change that. I didn't realize. Let me just make a note over here. I have to change that. I just copied it from there. That's what happened. Why do I do what I do? In other words, what are the reasons? That is consciousness and knowledge, awareness, intimate connection. It's the key to the emotions. Even though Bina is the mother of the emotions, the key to the emotions is called Da'at. In any event, we understand Chesed is kindness and love. Gvura is the concept of might or fear, privacy, setting boundaries, etc., etc. When it comes to the emotional qualities, they also have a negative quality. In other words, the negative quality of kindness would be lust or self-love. The negative quality of gvura, might or fear, privacy, setting boundaries is anger, jealousy, hatred, and so on and so forth. Similarly with Tiferet, the positive dimension of Tiferet is compassion, variety, change. The negative is pride, boasting, arrogance, etc., etc. And so it goes on with all of the Sephirot. The main thing is that the Sephirot are reflected in the soul. Now, why is this important? To go back to the original Mishnah, we will now understand something much better, and why I don't want to use the word breath of the living God, but rather the spirit of the living God. Because what are we talking about? When we talk about these Esses Sephirot Prima, the Esses Sephirot without limitation, without characterization, and so forth, and so on and so forth, these are the Sephirot that are hidden in the highest level of Adam Kadmon, or in the Or Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. So therefore, they are completely, drastically concealed from us. The example is given of what is called the fire within the coal. When the coal is burning, there's fire outside the coal, and that fire outside the coal is enlivened and made present. Essentially, it's how shall I say? The fire outside the coal is given its life, given its existence through the fire inside the coal. It's only that the outside of the coal is burning the fuel on the outside of the coal, but it's the revelation of the fire that's inside the coal. Without fire inside the coal, there would likely not be fire outside the coal. In other words, when the coal goes out, when the inside fire in the coal goes out, then the coal goes out, it's cold. It's not a coal anymore. It's not a block of wood. It's just, it's not an ember anymore. It's nothing. It's a burnt ember. It's a burnt out ember. So what we are talking about here, these 10 Sephirot, are like the fire inside the coal. Now, how do you bring a fire from inside the coal outside the coal so that it can catch a light in a visible way, or that it can transmit its inner fire to other combustible objects all around it? So the way that that's done is through blowing on the coal. In order, as everybody I'm sure is familiar with, in order to make the coal burst into flame, you blow on it. If it's the coal is a light inside, it's a glowing ember, but in order to make it, bring the fire outside of it, that's through blowing on the coal. Now, this concept of blowing on the coal is obviously the idea of breath. We blow with our breath. But it's not only that. Obviously, if we're talking about in terms of spiritual matters, revealing the inner dimension of the Sephirot, so to speak, as they are in the coal, we're not talking about breath. We're talking about the spirit of godliness that has to be brought out. The spirit of godliness that has to be brought out. Now, there's an explanation in Hasidic terminology in one of the famous Hasidic works, which is actually called Teres Menachem. It's from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the late Lubavitcher Rebbe, who passed away in Tafshin Nun Beis, which was 2002. In any event, the Rebbe explains over there that the fire within the coal is only an analogy, it's a metaphor for the fire in the soul. It's not the fire in the coal that counts, it's the fire in the soul that counts. And when we bring out the fire from inside the soul, so to speak, then we draw down the divine spirit, the divine energy, the divine ruach, as it's called, what he calls here the breath of the living God. I don't want to use the breath, but the spirit. We bring down the spirit of the living God. Okay. So he's the one, the person is the one that brings down or brings out what's inside. In other words, what's concealed, the person is able to bring out. How is he able to do that? Because the essence of the soul is essentially part of God above. That's what it says in the famous book in Tanya. It's called Tanya or Likutei Amarim, from the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, from Rabbi Shneur Zalman Liadi. In the second chapter, he explains that the soul is part of God above. In other words, since it's part of God above, the soul is essentially infinite. It's only the revelation of godliness. So therefore, when the soul becomes revealed, when the inner dimensions of the soul become revealed, they draw down that inner dimension of godliness into reality. Now, of course, the question is, how is this done? How is this relevant to the most sort of mundane enterprises and the most ordinary people like ourselves? How is this relevant? What do we do? How do we actually do this? So first of all, there are different levels in such a thing. The first and the highest level is obviously Nevuah, prophecy, but there are various levels of prophecy. There's a level of prophecy which is called Ruach HaKodesh, the divine spirit which motivates people. Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, which is within us as well. And that is within the grasp. To be a prophet, one has to be on an extremely lofty level. A prophet is able to do all kinds of, he's able to change the natural laws of the universe, transcend them, because he already, for himself, he transcended them, and therefore a prophet is able to draw things down which could not possibly be done by anybody else, other than another prophet. Of course, we're not talking about being done by God. Of course, that can be done, but a prophet is able to draw these things down because of his elevated spiritual level. But a lower spiritual level, Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration, or the Holy Spirit, if you want to call it that. In Judaism, it's usually translated as divine inspiration. That divine inspiration also draws down godliness. It draws down godliness into this world. It brings it from a state of concealment, brings godliness from a state of concealment into a state of revelation. It brings the 10 Sephirot, which are hidden, into revelation in the 10 powers of the soul that we just had a look at the chart of that particular thing. Okay. Therefore, it is called ruach because it's ruach hakodesh. Instead of calling it the breath, breath for breath, we're talking about the spirit of godliness that's natural to every soul, that is brought out in a person's own spirit, so to speak, in his ruach hakodesh, in his divine inspiration. Now, of course, even in this, there are very many different levels. The level of, for example, those the authors of the Mishnah and the authors of the Gemara, the Talmud, were on a very high level. They were also able to perform all kinds of amazing miracles. And it's quite an interesting thing to see that in retrospect, sometimes we realize that we were also involved in a miraculous event. It demands a certain amount of meditation and contemplation to be able to actually come to that realization and to understand, for example, just missing an accident or getting involved in an accident turns out only to be a minor thing. It could have been a major thing, if things didn't turn out the way they did, it could have been a person could have lost their life and so on and so forth. There's all kinds of things that happen that are, in fact, if we look at them with clear eyes, we can see that there are, or with clear understanding, we can see that these are miraculous events. I tell you the truth, just giving birth to a child is a miraculous event. It's just amazing how the child grows in the womb and then it's born and so on. So it's a miraculous event. It's really, there's a lot of miracles that happen that we don't deem miracles because they happen to be miracles that are clothed within nature. Of course, we generally understand that most miracles are what transcends nature and to a certain extent defy the laws of nature. That is true. But nevertheless, there are miracles clothed within nature that are nevertheless miracles. Okay, so one of the ways in which this is done, obviously, is through contemplation. Through contemplating the powers of the soul as being a reflection of much higher divine powers, and by using the powers of the soul in positive ways to reveal that godliness in the world. There are other things as well, for example, by studying Torah, particularly the inner dimensions of Torah, one comes to certain revelations and certain understandings that are also ultimately a revelation of, so to speak, the divine mind, if you want to put it, in that terminology. But the interesting thing is that all of it starts from this aspect of ruach, which I call spirit, which he calls wind or breath. He calls it breath, another translation of it is wind. So we see that the breath of the living God becomes breath from breath. What does that mean? It means that the breath up above, or as I translated, the spirit up above, is reflected in the spirit down below. And as you probably heard the expression, it's truly a very good expression and very, very worthwhile, perhaps couching in somewhat different language, but they say like this: it's not the nature of the dog in the fight, it's the nature of the fight in the dog that really counts. Not the dog in the fight, but the fight in the dog. Now, we're talking about dogs is not what we're doing here, but the same thing is true about it's the fiery spirit of the soul that counts, and not the fact that there is a soul. It's this fiery spirit of the longing and the desire to reveal godliness in the world and in ourselves that fires up the whole process, that gives us the fight, so to speak, the ability, the inspiration and the challenge and the perseverance to carry on with this particular approach. Okay, we see the same thing in the physical world. Even in the physical world, as you probably know, in ancient terminology, they did not look at the elements oxygen, hydrogen, and so on and so forth, the basic elements, but they looked at the elements as certain components of nature without which this world would be a completely different world, or it even wouldn't exist. One of them is air, one of them is water, one of them is fire, and the other one is earth. Okay, earth, water, fire, and air. Those are the four main elements, and there's what's called the ether, the spiritual aspect of these things. But this is all in the physical sense, so to speak. Now, just as we see that fire without air will not be fire anymore. If you close off the air from a fire, it simply goes out. Similarly, water depends on air as well, because air is what lifts the water up. It's what makes waves. It's what evaporates the water along with heat. But it evaporates the water, moves it around, and so on and so forth. Without air, basically the water would be very still. In order to make water still, obviously it's load of all the air, and you prevent it from moving that way. Okay, so we see that air is of great significance to all the other four, to all the other three rather, elements, to earth as well. Without air, the earth would not be able to produce its produce. It wouldn't be able to produce crops and so on and so forth. Therefore, we see that air, or wind, or breath as he calls it, and what in the spiritual dimension is the concept of spirit, is the most important of the elements. In the physical world, the most important of the elements, which all the other elements rely on, they're interreliable to a certain extent, but they all rely on air in order to do the functions which they need to do. Okay, so therefore, says the Ramak, Rabbi Moshe Cordovera, the author of the Paradise, who was the generation, or a couple of generations before the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzhak Luria. He was the master redactor of Kabbalah, primarily from the Zohar, and the primary explainer until the Arizal came along with a whole new system. But he explained the descent of the world, the descent of the Sephirot, the nature of the Sephirot, and so on and so forth. He regards the concept of avir, of ruach and avir mean the same thing, air, as the aspect of keter. The aspect of keter. In the Sephirot, keter is the highest of the Sephirot. The Arizal tends to favor the view that air is the aspect of chokhmah rather than keter. In other words, the first of the immanent Sephirot, rather than the first. Keter is a transcendent Sephirah. Chokhmah is an immanent Sephirah, right? That's the first of the immanent Sephirot, and it gives rise to all of the other Sephirot. All the other Sephirot ultimately come out of Chokhmah. We're not talking about influence, because Bina has more influence, Dat has more influence on the emotional qualities, etc. But all of the Sephirot essentially emerge into their manifest state through Chokhmah. Yes, it's true that everything emerges from Keter, but Keter is a non-immanent state, it's a transcendent state, and therefore, to a certain extent, is out of our reach. It's essentially out of our reach. What's in our reach is Chokhmah and downwards. Okay. It could be that the Arizal and the Ramak are not, in fact, arguing, because it could be that we're talking about Chokhmah within Keter, which is called Chokhmah Stima, but let's not go there because it's not really of great importance to our understanding of this idea. So one of the things that reveals the inner qualities is the ability to speak. The ability to speak in Aramaic, in the language of the Zohar, Aramaic, is called ruach mamalala, the spirit of speech. So speech really is one of the ways in which we reveal thought. In other words, what's hidden inside, on a higher level, comes out through the words that we utter. Now, very often, we say things and we do things and we act in certain ways that reveal sort of subliminal attitudes and subliminal ideas and subliminal things that we're thinking about that are below the level of consciousness, subliminal. They're below the level of consciousness, and we sometimes express these in facial expressions, sometimes in words. We say words that somehow have seemingly no relation to what we said before, just that somehow seem to slip out of our mouths. That's unconscious things. That is coming from generally a very high level. But in general, the revelation of thought in a deliberate sense is through speech. Similarly, the revelation of godliness is through speech, in the sense that the divine plan was implemented through, as it says in the first chapter of Bereshit, and God said there shall be light, and there was light, and God said there shall be water, and so on and so forth. All of the 10 utterances through which what was hidden and transcendent became manifest in a physical world through the idea of speech. So, ruach is the power that manifests itself. It's the breath that manifests itself in speech. Without the ability to breathe, we would not be able to utter words. Without the air in our lungs, we wouldn't be uttering words, because all of the vocal cords in the throat, and that's how we actually learn words, and we express them with our lips and with our tongue and teeth and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, it all begins essentially with breath, which is probably why Rabbi Kaplan translates it as breath, because we are talking about the manifestation of what's on a very high level, bringing it down to a much lower level. Therefore, breath is important. In any event, this is all drawn down through speech, and obviously what's drawn down through speech, it depends on what we say. If we speak holy words, then what's revealed is holiness. If we speak guttural words, gutter words, then what's revealed is the contents of the gutter, so to speak. And therefore, obviously, we have to, certainly in prayer and certainly in study, we have to be very careful to use the right speech, even when conversing with other people, using foul language, and not only foul language, but criticism and belittling people and someone humiliating others is obviously not the way to go. That's not going to reveal godliness. That's going to reveal exactly the opposite. So to sum up, this last Mishnah, this last teaching in the chapter brings everything that we learned about in the previous classes into the focus of what do we do about it. The first thing we do is we meditate, we understand where things are, and then from understanding we bring forth in speech and perhaps in writing as well, but we bring forth the ideas that are the revelation of holiness, the revelation of godliness. How are we able to do that? Because our souls are essentially part of God above, and therefore we have those kinds of powers. And that is the essential teaching of this last Mishnah in Sefer Yetzirah. Are there any questions, folks? I did want to mention, and I forgot to mention it previously, I did want to mention that I hope he doesn't mind, the name of a good friend of ours, Paul Koploy, who was very generous in helping to sponsor this particular class. His generosity is really appreciated. I sent him a letter personally, but an email rather. But all of those who, I'll comment on that in a minute. All of those who who help in one way or another, even by just coming to the classes or by commenting and so on and so forth. All of this is much appreciated by yours truly. Okay. Can I comment on a bit on fire from water, what that means? Yes. In the terms of the Sephirot, let me just share screen again. In terms of the Sephirot, the fire from water, Chesed was regarded as water. Kindness is water. I think I spoke about that in last week's class, not the Wednesday class, but the Thursday night class, the concept of Chesed and water, when I spoke about the concept of water, which, by the way, I think was Ben Waxman's question and not just Kirshner's. I made a mistake. But in any event, the idea of Chesed is water. The idea of Gvura is fire, right? Gvura is fire. So Chesed is water, Gvura is fire. Gvura ultimately stems from Chesed. How? Because Chesed, kindness, without limitations, leads to tragedy. Ultimately, it leads to unkindness. Because if kindness is not limited in the proper way, in the proper channels, then it becomes, I don't want to get political, but I'll give you an example. For instance, if you have compassion on someone who's a violent criminal and you let them out of jail early and without the proper re-education, and you let them out of whatever, you let them off, you lighten their sentence, you let them out of jail, someone who has not reformed themselves, someone who doesn't know how to control themselves, is out of your kindness is going to go and commit another crime and maybe even hurt or kill somebody else. Certainly damage other people's property or abscond with other people's property, whatever it is. So you can see that limitations on chesed are necessary. Unlimited chesed, unlimited kindness turns out to be not kindness at all. Turns out to be the opposite of kindness. Therefore, kindness needs limitation in order to have the proper channels. That's how gvura, eish, comes out of water, right? Fire comes out of water. In other words, gvura comes out of chesed. It's part of chesed to find the right channels and limit them to those channels, which is a concept of gvura. That's a concept of fire. I hope that answers that question. All right. Anyone else have a question? All right, folks, we'll leave it at that then for tonight. If there's no more questions, if someone's typing, type fast. Otherwise, this will be up on YouTube hopefully tonight. And alrighty, everybody. Thank you, Laurie. Thank you for your support as well. I forgot to mention you. I appreciate it. And for all of you who helped support this channel and so on, whatever way. Okay, thanks, folks. And I don't think there's going to be a class tomorrow night. In fact, I'm sure there's not going to be a class tomorrow night because I'm undergoing a procedure which I have to have general anesthetic for. I don't think I'm going to be in a position to give a class tomorrow night. So no class tomorrow night. And yes, I am going to rest. You're welcome, Wendy. All my best to you. All right. Okay, folks, we'll call it a day. Leave it at that, and no class tomorrow night again. Good night. You are very welcome, Meli Melech.